There are fears of war breaking out in the Horn of Africa as tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea run high. Both sides have moved troops toward their shared border. Ethiopia accuses Eritrea of backing rebels and having troops on its soil. Eritrea denies the accusations. Now, relations between Addis Ababa and Asmara have been uneasy since Eritrea gained independence in 1993. The countries have fought deadly wars since then. Now, the recent escalation has come after Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced his intention to regain access to the Red Sea. Eritrea fears he will try to achieve this by invading its territory. Now, Ethiopia lost its access to the Red Sea and became landlocked in 1993 when an international ruling gave Eritrea sovereign control over the Red Sea ports of Assab and Massawa. Since then, Ethiopia has relied on ports in neighbouring countries, mostly Djibouti, for trade. The government says the lack of direct access to the Red Sea comes at a significant economic cost for the country, and Abiy Ahmed says he is pursuing all options to change this.
What we need is outlets to the sea, from whichever direction, whether through purchase, lease, or some form of agreement. Whichever way, this is what we want. Our population is increasing, and we will not be able to shoulder this burden much longer.
Now, Abiy's ambitions were on display at a recent military parade in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia's special forces demonstrated maneuvers in a spectacle widely seen as intended for neighbouring Eritrea to see. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged Ethiopia and Eritrea to respect the border treaty they signed 25 years ago, and others in the region have called for talks. Help us understand the developments that have led to the rumours of war in Ethiopia. We've invited Tsedali Lema onto the programme. She is the founder of Addis Standard. That's a monthly news magazine headquartered in Addis Ababa. Welcome to DW News Africa, Tsedali. Why don't we begin by just looking at what are the clearest warning signs you've seen that indicate war between Ethiopia and Eritrea could break out at any time?
Well, there is a clear sign, but most importantly, there is a convergence of multiple signs. This is not just a possible war involving Eritrea and Ethiopia, but also involving the Tigray region. We are seeing an increased rhetoric of accusations and counter-accusations, but they're mostly coming from the federal government that is accusing the Tigrayan political and military leaders of colluding with Eritrea. And these were accompanied by, or compounded by, shall I say, a small skirmish that erupted last month in the Tigray region that has led a quick mobilization of the federal government's forces towards the region. So we are looking at a massive mobilization of forces by the federal government towards the Tigrayan territories, but also that rhetoric by the federal government accusing Tigrayan forces and of Eritrean forces colluding to unseat the federal government. So there are this convergence of signs that we see from these sides, but most importantly, it is from the government, the federal government side, that makes the possibilities of a war erupting more likely.
And then there's this aspect of the fears in Eritrea that remarks that have been made by Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed about ambitions to secure access to the Red Sea. In Eritrea, the fear is that that means its territory being violated. Could you just expand on that thread for us?
Yeah, it's not just the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. It's also the military leaders, the senior military leaders, and the political class of the ruling party in Ethiopia and their backers. They have framed the access to the Red Sea as an existential, and they are increasingly asserting their rhetoric. It's not just diversification of port access, as is widely understood by the international community, but a sovereign access to the Red Sea. And that has given the narrative that it's not just a country of 120 million or 30 million people seeking access, diversified access, but a sovereign access and a military presence, I think, a Navy presence. That is the ambition. The federal government has framed its actors as a national interest. So it is coming with that. But also there is a narrative from the Ethiopian side that is increasingly questioning the sovereignty, the statehood of the Eritrean state, the way Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia, for example. The Prime Minister was in the parliament a few months ago, or even a few weeks, I think in October 2025, when he told lawmakers that he doesn't have any document that justifies the Assab port to belong to Eritrea, or even questioning the very referendum that has saw Eritrea's independence from Ethiopia in 1994. So this kind of framing is putting quite a lot of concern from Asmara that their understanding of Ethiopia's access to the Red Sea or to port diversification is a sovereign access that is going to be encroaching on their sovereignty. So the framing is the one that is really inflaming the rhetoric, what the federal government wants and how they are framing it.
For people outside of Ethiopia who were introduced to Abiy Ahmed as this peacemaker winning the Nobel Peace Prize, it's just a bit hard to imagine that this is somebody who's prepared to involve Ethiopia in yet another conflict. Have all diplomatic avenues been exhausted in Addis Ababa trying to secure deals with neighbouring countries to get access to the Red Sea?
There are two things here. Number one, the framing that Abiy Ahmed as a peacemaker drives its origin from probably the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to him when so to say, he attempted to normalize relations with Eritrea. That is the framing. But that's not what exactly happened. So first of all, there was no peace agreement that was qualified, for example, by the Ethiopian parliament. We really don't know what the two leaders have signed in Saudi Arabia when they tried to normalize relations in 2018. What we know is that their relationship has morphed into a military and intelligence alliance against the Tigrayan leaders, what that was manifested in the 2 years devastating war that the two came together in waging that war against Tigray. So what is concretely known for us Ethiopians, is that their relationship was anchored in their common enemy of the TPLF, which turned out to be really against the Tigrayan people when you see the conduct of the war. So there is that element that there was no really peace to begin with. The second element is that you said the diplomatic efforts. There are diplomatic efforts. You see shuttles happening between even the U.S. government by assigning special envoys to the Horn of Africa that were quite busy. But we still don't know what is being negotiated, what is in terms of the backdoor diplomatic channels. It is a diplomatic shuttle that is not anchored in really nothing. No peace agreement that was codified since the rapprochement. There is not even the resuscitation of the Algerian peace agreement that was signed in 2000 between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So it's within that background that we see the diplomatic shuttle happening today.
And can you talk us through some of the internal dynamics in Ethiopia? For instance, how much support is there in the country for Abiy Ahmed's ambition to pursue access to the Red Sea by force?
Well, you will be surprised in terms of the media narrative, the elite, including academic and intellectual elite. There is that echoing through the national TV, through this very excessive media broadcasting about it. So there is that support in terms of people expressing their regret about, the way Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia, for example. That has never sat very well among Ethiopian political elite. And so you would think you would be also misled if you see the narrative on the national TV. On the ground, though, Abiy Ahmed and his military will be struggling to galvanize, to coalesce the kind of military support that they did, for example, for the war in the Tigray region. For one thing, they have fallen apart with their alliances in the Amhara regional state, for example, with the Fano. They are now openly at war with Fano leaders. So there is a very aggressive insurgency that is happening in the Amhara region. There is an old insurgency happening in the Oromia region with the involving the Oromo Liberation Army and the federal forces. This one actually dates back to early 2019. So there are these increased militarized insurgencies on the ground. So the federal government will be struggling to coalesce the same kind of support that they have brought together in the war against the Tigray region. And there are also other, non-militarized and militarized violences that are spreading all over the country. What we are seeing at the moment, for example, is following the massive mobilization of federal forces towards the Tigrayan border, we've seen an uptick in local insurgencies. Just last week, there has been a massacre of Orthodox Christian followers in the Oromia region in RC zone, in East RC zone, that is still ongoing as we speak right now. And there has been a severe vacuum of security apparatus on the ground. And that shows you that this support, the military support from the different actors that are actively engaged in militarized conflicts in the country might be hard to come by, as opposed to how it was during the war in the Tigray region.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your insight into the ongoings and the dynamics within the country at this present time. That is Tidali Lema, the founder of Addis Standard. We appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Christine.
Well, as we've just heard, the Ethiopian government is already fighting domestic threats, predominantly from armed groups in the Amhara, Oromia and Tigray regions. Beyond its borders, the friction is spreading, and not just with Eritrea. Ethiopia is accused of backing the RSF paramilitaries in Sudan's civil war, infuriating the Sudanese government in Khartoum. It has signed a controversial port deal with the breakaway region of Somaliland, which Somalia sees as a violation of its sovereignty. And to the north, there's the dispute with Egypt. That's over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile River. This leaves Ethiopia at the center of multiple overlapping tensions. To give us a perspective of how a conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea could impact the region is Zacharias Zelalem. He is a visiting fellow with the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's also an award-winning journalist and analyst focusing on the Horn of Africa region. Welcome to DW News Africa, Zacharias. Is Ethiopia ready to go to war with Eritrea? What is the state of the country's military after the Tigray conflict?
Well, it's hard to say whether or not the army is ready to go for a renewed all-out war. What is known is that the army has been bogged down with internal conflict, something of a quagmire really in both Ethiopia's Amhara and Oromia regions, and that is where the Eritrean army has the advantage. Since the devastation of the Tigray war that killed hundreds of thousands from 2020 to 2022, the Eritrean army has not been active in any conflict and has had the time to recuperate. So there's definitely that would definitely impact any war, despite the fact that the Ethiopian army would probably enjoy some degree of aerial supremacy.
Yeah, and how capable is Eritrea to defend itself against what is its much bigger neighbor, Ethiopia?
Well, I believe the Eritrean army isn't planning on testing its battle-hardened forces alone. The consensus is that it plans on funding and arming as many of the different Ethiopian rebel factions to serve as a sort of buffer to prevent direct face-to-face conflict between the two armies. So perhaps by wearing down the Ethiopian troops, who, as I said, are already bogged down on two separate fronts, it would not have to bear the brunt of Ethiopian assaults. But At the end, like I said, though, they've had 3 years to recuperate. They're also being allegedly supported by the likes of Egypt and the Sudanese armed forces, amongst other partners in the region. So all that could sway things in the war from one side to the other.
Yeah, and I guess we'll talk about some of these other countries in a moment, but Eritrea fought alongside the Ethiopian government against the TPLF in the Tigray war that you were just referring to. The TPLF and Eritrea are now said to be in alliance, working together against the government of Ethiopia.
Yeah, even for seasoned observers of the region, it was a plot twist that not many saw coming. It's essentially you have the Tigrayan rebels who, until a few years ago, were accusing Eritrean forces of carrying out a genocide against their people. Now, suddenly, on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, are suddenly allied and are believed to be coordinating militarily alongside each other, at least over the course of the past year or so. So that caught many off guard. And at the same time, if war is to break out, there's also the possibility that additional rebel factions that are also believed to be supported by the Eritrean government may also find themselves aligned alongside the TPLF, including the Amhara-based Fano forces, who were also enemies and fighting against the TPLF alongside the Ethiopian government and Eritrean forces back in during the first war from 2020 to 2022. So there's been numerous realignments of the various warring factions, and a lot of it can be hard to track for those who aren't as well versed with the affairs of the region.
Yeah, and speaking of the region, Ethiopia doesn't appear to have many friends in the neighborhood. There's bad blood with Sudan, with Egypt, with Somalia. How do you see these countries potentially responding if conflict were to break out between Ethiopia and Eritrea?
Well, that's the thing. The regional powers from the Gulf and the extended Middle East, so the likes of Turkey even, they all have a vested stake in this conflict. Some of them want one faction or the other to defeat one. And the truth is, you could argue that the Ethiopian government has been something of a client state for the United Arab Emirates for some 6 or 7 years now. And as such, it has been supported and armed by the United Arab Emirates, and that has gotten it involved in the conflict in neighboring Sudan, where Ethiopia has been found to have provided training ground on its territory for the genocidal rapid support forces, which have wreaked havoc in neighboring Sudan. So unlike the war that killed hundreds of thousands from 2020 to 2022, this one might see regional spillovers and the involvement of multiple players from across the region. But of course, that also might be impacted by the ongoing and deteriorating situation in the Middle East, where Iran is now bombing many of the Gulf countries, including the United Arab Emirates, which is supposed to play a decisive role in any Ethiopian military offensives and campaigns if war is to break out.
That was journalist and analyst Zacharias Zelalem talking to me earlier. Now, Ethiopia and Eritrea have a long history of tensions. We can start the timeline in 1993, when after decades of a devastating liberation struggle, Eritrea officially gained independence from Ethiopia. But just 5 years later, a border dispute spiraled into full-scale war. It lasted 2 years and cost tens of thousands of lives. And then in the year 2000, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire, but relations remained hostile and heavily militarized for the next 2 decades. In 2018, Ethiopia's new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki signed a historic peace deal. Borders reopened and both sides restored diplomatic ties. Now, for his efforts in pursuing this breakthrough, Abiy Ahmed was awarded the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. 1 year later, despite their past hostility, both countries came together to fight the forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front in northern Ethiopia. It was a bitter war with tens of thousands killed in the fighting. Many more, mainly civilians, died from starvation. And now relations between Addis Ababa and Asmara are broken. Rhetoric is sharpening and troops are on the move.